DNA of the soul.
Welcome, I'm your host Kenny, and you're listening to Social Sleuth. Today I'm joined by two of the authors of Mobilizing Data for Justice, a guide to activism in the digital age. Chris Hurl and Kevin Walby are two social scientists who co-authored this Between the Lines publication with Elena Rowan and Maria Seneville. If you're listening to this podcast, the book is live and available for purchase. As I record this, I am awaiting my pre-ordered copy, and I encourage you to give it a read alongside me and check out the project more broadly. In this episode, we unpack some of the findings, goals, and overall structure of the book and touch on the various real-life examples and insights gathered from generous social movement communities. Chris and Kevin offer a wealth of knowledge, and I'm excited for you to listen to my first episode with two guests. Let's get into it.
Drum roll, please. Can anybody guess?
Welcome, Chris and Kevin, to Social Sleuth. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
Sort of an icebreaker, maybe, Kevin, you're familiar with this, but I like to ask people how they define a meme.
Well, I just think it's like a common feature of communication. I think we're copying each other and copying ideas and reconveying those way more than we usually give ourselves credit for. Yeah, I think that memes are really germane forms of communication. I think we're using them all the time, borrowing from each other all the time. And the more digital version of it it's what we see a lot, but I think the way we communicate, there's a lot of memes in everyday life.
Absolutely. I would have to agree. Chris, do you have any definition of a meme that differs at all?
I just think about that dog in the burning house saying, "This is fine." And basically, I guess a meme like that is one that gets taken up and circulated and adapted for people in kind of sending certain kinds of messages that kind of use that dynamic as a way of illustrating what's going on. So it's kind of interesting how it kind of integrates this visual kind of element in enabling us to send messages in ways that kind of go beyond words.
Absolutely. I love both of those definitions. It's so fun to hear how everybody interprets memes a little bit differently, but we're all talking about the same thing. But now that that's sort of out of the way, I wonder if you would each mind giving sort of a brief background of who you are and what you do.
For sure. I can go first. I'm Kevin. I teach at University of Winnipeg in criminal justice, but it's more like a justice studies department or social justice studies department. And a lot of my research is on policing, surveillance, social control kind of stuff.
And I'm Chris Hurl, and I'm a sociologist, associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University. And I do research on political economy, social movements, and the sociology of knowledge.
Awesome. Lots of cool stuff. We have some good expertise with us today. And we're talking about a book that you both co-authored along with Elena and Marius. What first got each of you interested in how people use data to fight for justice?
Well, on my end, I've been interested for a long time in public sector struggles, and I'm interested in struggles around privatization, how public services are being sold off to private companies or have come to operate like private companies. And there's been a lot of social struggles around that in public utilities and universities and healthcare, other places, right? And so in doing research on those issues, I found that some of the most knowledgeable people were actually social activists on the ground that were fighting in these kinds of struggles. And through engaging with those in power, these activists came to kind of learn how these institutions worked. And so I started getting interested in the methods and strategies that activists developed in gathering and mobilizing data. And we can look at social justice struggles here as a sort of learning process. Both Kevin and I are really influenced by this idea of social movement learning and how through the process of engaging in social justice struggles, people learn how things work and make sense of and kind of make sense of the institutions that they engage with that as they kind of struggle with that.
Yeah, and on my side, I guess there's a couple of sources for how I got interested in this. One, a long time ago, I used to do some work with a PIRG. I don't know if listeners will know what a PIRG is, but it's a public interest research group. In Ontario, a lot of the universities have PIRGs. And at the PIRG, we started doing freedom of information requests, learning from investigative journalists. And then from that, I started to use freedom of information in my own research and pay attention to where other activists and advocates and journalists are using FOI to investigate big organizations around them. I guess the other side of it is I've done work in surveillance studies for a while, and in surveillance studies there's some terms like surveillance and surveillance from below, and it's any kind of information gathering that kind of reverses the gaze and starts looking at these powerful institutions. An example could be groups that engage in cop watching, and they collect all this video data about police malfeasance. So from PIRGs and surveillance studies, I've really learned a lot from folks who were working with data to fight for justice.
Amazing. It's really interesting how you both came into this, obviously with different expertise and different interests and different goals, perhaps. And I wonder, was there a particular gap in the literature that you were trying to fill with this book? And if so, can we sort of talk a little bit about that?
I find that if we're talking about academic literature, the academic literature on social movements has really not been very inspiring for me. I find like a lot of academic literature on social movements tends to treat social movements as an object of analysis, and there's no sense that people in social movements are knowers themselves, and they are doing their own research, right? And employing their own methods and trying to make sense of what's going on, right? And so very, very little, there's very little actually, I think, written that kind of takes the perspective of people actually on the ground engaging in this research through the course of struggle and seeing how they operate as knowers themselves. So that's kind of what we tried to do here.
I think that one other thing that we do, we didn't necessarily explicitly set out to do this, but it just sort of happened, is a lot of social movement studies books are case studies of one kind of movement in one area of life, one movement in one sector of struggle, if you like. Whereas we talk to folks from across different struggles, across sectors, about how they put knowledge together, how they do research, how they investigate the world around them. So it's a slightly different angle on social movements, not just a case study-based approach.
I think both of what you've said is very compelling as well. I see a lot of value in, yes, the people that are on the ground doing the work within social movements are often discredited or not given sort of the, what's the word? Maybe perhaps like the validity in knowing. And then I totally see what you're saying, Kevin, I've definitely read a lot of this literature, both in my undergrad and now after. But it is very case study dependent, and it's sort of separated into these different compartments. And I'm excited to read Mobilizing Data for Justice for that reason. And sort of into the contents of the book, from what I can see of just sort of the promotional page on the publishing website. But there's talk of communities of practice. And I wonder, what does that look like?
Yeah, so we talk about communities of practice and care. That's our first chapter. It's, if you look at data activism, you might think about starting from surveillance or, in terms of thinking about archives or social media or whatever, our starting point is kind of recognizing how, um, how community building in this process is based on kind of skillful practices, strategies, and in the academic literature, people discuss communities of practices, typically involving a group of people that share a common concern and kind of develop a shared set of practices for making it sense and engaging with that concern. So very often it's focused on folks like doctors or social workers, right? Uh, they'll develop a community of practice around a specific issue, and together they'll share strategies and challenges that they're facing and kind of addressing these problems and talk together about it. And we kind of extend this idea in looking at social activists and how social activists kind of come together and develop and share different strategies, share challenges, right? And through a process of trial and error, developing different methods for engaging in the institutional and digital world that they find themselves in. And that involves a lot of learning, right? Learning as a collective practice, which again, I think speaks to what a community of practice involves.
That makes a lot of sense. Like you said, when we're thinking of data activism, a lot of the time we're thinking about surveillance. So I do want to talk about that. We know that platforms watch everything that we do, and your chapter on negotiating surveillance infrastructures, from my understanding, covers both watching those in power while also trying to evade being watched. It kind of touched on the surveillance piece already. What's one way activists are navigating this double-edged sword of surveillance? Maybe there's another example, the police watch.
Yeah, I can jump in first. So I think we used a few methods for the book. So we talked to some folks about the work that they do, the way that they organize, the tools that they use. And we also reviewed some of their publications. Like some of them have very interesting guidebooks on activism, guidebooks on contesting surveillance. That was another great source for us. So one of the groups that we talked to in South Africa, for example, they have been organizing for a long time against state surveillance, and it's a very practical thing in their everyday life. Like the risks of organizing for them are real, and they have to be careful how they organize, how they share information. And at the same time, they are trying to organize their communities, build capacity to mount a kind of mass movement against state surveillance. And they produce guidebooks, they produce tip sheets for people. And so they are kind of navigating both sides. They are investigating the state, they're organizing, but they're also collecting information and encouraging others to do the same.
It's good to hear about tangible things that people are actually doing to do this. I think a lot of the literature, or even just anecdotal conversations and discourse online, is there is nothing to be done. And I sort of like how your book is actually, you've interviewed people, you're talking to people that are actually doing this and showing, at least on the outside looking in, of what we can do. And maybe it's not a how-to guide, but sort of what is possible.
I was just going to say the group in South Africa that we worked with, and some of the other groups, I mean, they are interested in specific techniques for collecting information or specific techniques for evading surveillance from the state, but they're always grounded in like movement building and capacity building, and that's what I think sets them apart maybe from more off-the-shelf corporate tools people might have for protecting their own personal privacy. It goes way beyond that for the groups we talk to.
And would you say that's sort of more of a collective approach that is being had, or is this about the goal and the intention?
Well, I think that in the South African context, in some of the places in Central America where we talk to, I mean, again, they're communities, they're collectives, and they're trying to bring people into this struggle. And they also have different ways of organizing to pass on teachings, pass on techniques for collecting data and also evading surveillance. So I think it's what social movements have always done, but there are just some new dimensions to it in the digital age.
I do want to get more into that, and I'm unsure if your work explored this, but did memes ever come up as playing a role in how the user or activists negotiate surveillance within mainstream networks?
Interestingly, we didn't really get into memes all that much in our book, and it didn't really come up all that much in our interviews. But I'm curious what you think about the relationship between memes and surveillance. I think
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
wrote. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I asked this question because of sort of an earlier interview I've done this week, and then also sort of the foundation of creating this podcast is that relationship between memes and surveillance. And I was talking with Dr. Edwin Hodge out of the University of Victoria, and his sort of research into alt-right groups and sort of extremism movements, and how they are able to sort of work around surveillance and sort of even doxing and things like that are happening online. And memes are a way that they use, like within symbols and signs, to sort of have these beacons to people that they are in group or out group. So I just wonder if that bleeds into like a social good and social movements in the digital space.
Yeah, we didn't really get into that much in the surveillance chapter. One area which it might connect to more is we have a chapter on visualization, data visualizations, and how social movements can effectively kind of engage it with data visualizations, create visualizations as a way of mobilizing people. And it's kind of interesting when you talk about memes because, one way in which memes are effective is how easily they can be shared, circulated. But there are dilemmas with this, right? And in all of the chapters of our book, we're less focused on giving people solutions, but more focused on the dilemmas that activists face and the various ways in which they try to kind of develop strategies in kind of addressing those dilemmas. So with visualization, right? Uh, there's a challenge because on the one hand you want to create images that are easy to circulate that people will pick up very easily, but that those kinds of images can also hide a lot, right? They can mask authorship, where things are coming from, how they were created, and they can simplify things in terms of the messages that they're sending. So activists have often faced challenges here in terms of uh, remaining accountable, developing mechanisms of collective accountability, and kind of making it clear how authorship operates in the production of different kinds of visualizations, but also in a way that makes it easy for them to be circulated. And, I guess adding to that, the layer that you talk about in terms of surveillance, recognizing how if you make everything transparent, that might actually be dangerous for you in certain circumstances, right? So that's a challenge that people face, and they've different groups have kind of gone in different directions with this. And in the book, we kind of speak to some of the different directions that they take.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. I think that's definitely a good point to make as well. And something that maybe goes unsaid a lot is that, yes, memes can be used as these powerful, there's air quotes, but these powerful sort of communication methods and images that allow people to infer. But with that, you're sending it out sort of into the ether, and it's almost like a game of telephone. And when you're dealing with trying to actually mobilize social movements and navigate things with a goal beyond just recruitment, I think you're absolutely right. And obviously, those are with conversations with people that are actually doing this. I'm not that person. So it is really interesting. And I think it's important to bring up that they are not perfect and there are challenges to it. And that's maybe why we see certain groups utilizing it more than others.
I should also make clear with our book, we don't look at far right movements, right? So we're not looking at how all social movements use data, right? It's mobilizing data for social justice,
Yes.
right? And so we're engaging with groups that are kind of using data and engaging with data in more social justice oriented kinds of struggles.
That is a good disclaimer. No, I don't want there to be any confusion there. Just interesting to see how different mobilization efforts compare to each other. But yes, mobilizing data for justice is not talking about alt-right. Sort of jumping down my list of questions because we've brought up this idea of visualizing data. So you've mentioned from debunking to visceralization is the chapter. I think we're accustomed to the debunking phase. Is there anything else to say about what data visceralization looks like in practice? So we're creating images and sort of like a rethinking of infographics. What can people sort of imagine as data visceralization in this context?
And that kind of builds from what we were talking about before, right? In terms of developing context-rich kinds of visualizations that kind of speak to the collective authorship of the people producing it. In terms of debunking visualizations, first of all, it might be self-evident for a lot of people, but there are a lot of groups that are actively working to kind of expose, you know, AI images and things like that that are being used to legitimize a lot of stuff going on. And we interviewed a group called Bellingcat that does a lot of work around that. In terms of visceralization, that's a little bit less common a term. We got it from Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein. They wrote a great book a couple of years ago called Data Feminism, and I really recommend that book. It was really inspiring for us in writing our book. And when they talk about data visceralization, they speak to visceralization is like speaking to this idea of making data visceral, right? And so that means, first of all, kind of creating ways of sharing data that go beyond just the visual, right? And just using your eyes to kind of exploring how data can be something that can be felt in different ways and experienced in different ways, right? Also going beyond kind of a rational, impartial, distanced kind of scientist, how they approach data, recognizing how we can use data in ways that move us emotionally, right? And so a good example of that is we interviewed a group called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, right? And so what they've been doing, they started in San Francisco, and in San Francisco, they started mapping out the patterns of evictions that were going on. And so a lot of people were being displaced in San Francisco from the early 2000s onwards, forced out of their homes in order to make way for new condos and things like that. And so the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, it began in San Francisco. It's spread all around the world now. And when they started, they were doing a lot of maps where you just see the dots kind of expand in terms of all the numbers of people being evicted from all across the city. And you just see this as a series of dots and numbers. But they kind of recognized that they wanted to explore other ways of expressing the experience of eviction and how it was being felt by people in that context. And so beyond just focusing on these mapping visualizations and these proliferating dots, they had an oral history component of their project where they went out and interviewed people that were being evicted and shared their stories via their website in ways that you could not just see how many people were being evicted, but you could hear the physical kind of emotional toll it was taking on people by hearing their audio files, right? And they also started creating like different ways of expressing this data on murals on the sides of buildings, creating their own zines, right? And so kind of thinking outside the box in terms of what data is and how it can be shared and how it can be felt. And so that's an important part of the kind of exploring what we can do with data that kind of goes beyond the visual.
In that chapter that Chris mentioned on visualization, we also draw attention to the work of this group called Collective Orangotango. And for years and years, they've been doing workshops all around the world that bring a lot of this together, that maybe start with some kind of more linear map or some kind of numerical data, but then try to plot it in real life in a material space and bring in all kinds of other artistic and sensual and creative ways of making sense of a space. And I mean, we feature a little bit of what they do in our book, but they have their own books and their own guides that anyone doing any kind of activism, I think, should check out, especially when it comes to, going beyond the visual.
Awesome. That definitely made it more clear for myself, and sort of this idea of humanizing data is what I'm hearing. And I think that there's so many tangible ways to do that. So thank you for breaking that down for me. I did want to sort of scroll back up, sort of into the beginning of the book, or maybe the middle, I should say. This idea of the digital age has created a sense of infinite knowledge, but information online, as we know, is not all equal. We've talked about sort of this debunking aspect. But with that being said, how has the digital space activated a new wave of transparency and access to information? Or what effect has the digital space had on transparency and access? And this is my own argument that it has activated a new wave of transparency and access. So you can tell me if I'm wrong, but sort of how do we land there?
Yeah, I guess that in the book, and Chris can weigh in after, I think that we do focus on like the dual edge nature of these sorts of developments and the dilemmas that pop up. So yeah, in the digital age, we have things like Internet Archive, Wayback Machine, and everything is there almost. You can search for a lot of things. In the freedom of information space, you have more databases of previous disclosures. You can make the requests more easily. But at the same time, the digital, it creates some kinds of issues for certain groups, and it can also create its own kinds of obscurities. So it can create issues for other groups insofar as they then lose control over where their records are, who's looking at their records, what they're doing with them. This is an issue we bring up in relation to indigenous data sovereignty, but a couple other issues as well. And then in terms of new obscurities, like sometimes these databases, sometimes these approaches, if they're government built, they have all kinds of roadblocks just erected in the code. And you think it's going to be more clear and straightforward in terms of transparency, but it's not. It's just new kinds of ways of the state controlling information. So that's how I think of it. Is there's pluses and minuses.
Yeah, I would agree with the pluses and minuses. And I did want to sort of, since you've mentioned it, I wonder if we could unpack a bit more about this necessity to taking an intersectional or an equity-based approach to the ownership and management of data. Is that something you could speak to?
Yeah, I mean, it does connect to this bigger question. We have a whole chapter in our book on archiving and different practices of archiving in data activism. And our co-author, Elena Rowan, really spearheaded all of that research in terms of thinking about how social movements can archive data. And again, this is connecting to a dilemma, right? Because in the interest of transparency, openness, a lot of social activists are committing to making data as fully open and transparent as they can, right? And when we look at the history of data activism, right, early 2000s, early 90s, a lot of people operating in that space, we're very centrally focused on open data, right? And creating kind of an internet commons where everybody could get access to this information. Everybody could collaboratively work to create data and share it, to the greatest extent possible. This idea that information's not a commodity, right? And we should be working to decommodify it, to create spaces where we can freely share and exchange information, right? And that's a great ideal, and a lot of groups we spoke to that had this open data ideal. But then there are a lot of risks that are associated with open data, right? There's these risks in terms of, if you make data fully open, who has access to it? How are they going to use it, right? These days we're seeing how AI is extracting a lot of this data and harvesting it, right? And people's data is taken without their consent. It's plugged into these AI models in ways that are really problematic, and that consolidates the power of big tech in that area, right? And so there's this question of like, well, if you make data open, who's going to be using it? Who has access to it, right? Um, uh, and so when we're looking at open data, you can see how it can be taken and extracted and used as a way of intensifying policing and surveillance practices over different communities, right? And so there are risks associated with making data open. And the other side of that, we spoke to Indigenous activists that were kind of operating into the space of Indigenous data sovereignty, and it's interesting to compare that with the open data movement, because with Indigenous data sovereignty, there's a few different sets of kind of principles and practices that have been developed in that space. One is kind of OCAP approach that was developed by Indigenous activists in Canada, right? And they operate on the basis of ownership, control, access, and possession, right? And so Indigenous communities, if there is data that is being produced about them, right, that connects to their communities, then there should be strategies that are taken that that give them ownership over that data, that give them control over that data, that give them access to that data, that gives them infrastructure through which they can possess that data. And so you can see how this is, from an Indigenous data sovereignty perspective, like the open data movement has been problematized because it can undermine those principles, and this idea that when we're talking about data that's being created by and for a community, there should be principles of stewardship put in place in terms of how it can be managed, who can share it, right? And so, like I said before, like, we don't provide any easy solutions to these dilemmas, but we do explore how groups are kind of engaging with them and using them in different ways, right? And depending on what communities they're working with and what their aims are. And so that kind of speaks to, I think, the range of issues and strategies that are developed in relation to that.
Lots of great information. This idea of open data versus data sovereignty. And it definitely is a dilemma. I do want to circle back to this idea of open source and freedom of information requests and similar tools to sort of accessing data that have become increasingly popular with the removal of some barriers. And I do want to acknowledge Kevin's point that with the reduction of maybe visible barriers, there still are barriers, and there's more sort of challenges, whether that's more surveillance techniques or the like. So this is a focus of your book, of freedom information requests and like utilizing this data. I wonder if, and maybe this is outside of the book and more of a cultural question, but through events like leaks or investigations, do you think that's sort of reshaped in any way the collective or cultural boundaries that we have for critical inquiry? Sort of meaning, the more that we do this, does it inspire more very open-ended question as I read it to you, so you can definitely skip. But I just wonder if there is any effect there of social movements then inspiring others.
Yeah, well, I think we do address a little bit the idea of whistleblowing and leaks in the book. And I think that folks who do that have, they're facing a lot of heavy-handed responses from the state. And we've seen that with the Manning leaks and the Snowden leaks. And freedom of information stuff, I think, kind of fits in there a little bit because it's people trying to access state records that are not already a matter of the public interest, because they think there's something going on with government practices that everyone else should know about. And yeah, I mean, with a leak, it just becomes readily available if it's put into a database. With freedom of information, you kind of have to claw record by record at the state to put the whole picture together. And I think with freedom of information, there's a tendency not to do it because people think it's not going to lead to those kinds of big revelations, or they think it's just something that's a bit more of a lawyer's tool or a journalist's tool. And we talked to tons of data activists for the book who actually were using freedom of information, and I think they found it beneficial for opening things up a little bit more. Maybe not fully and completely, but a little bit more. So, for example, we talked to groups like Impact in Toronto. They're doing all kinds of housing justice work, and basically they use freedom of information in a community-based research or a participatory action kind of way, where they're getting ideas for how to make requests from the community, from the people they're working with. It's a bottom-up kind of approach to FOI, and then they mobilize that data to push the city and push the province for better access to housing, less control for landlords. That's just really practical stuff that makes a huge difference in people's lives, and they get it clawing away at the state for those records one at a time. We also talk to folks who are doing freedom of information work, and it's just part of their toolkit. Like we talked to the Lucy Parsons lab people in Chicago, and we talked to the STOP, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project in New York, the Right to Know group, again, in South Africa, and they're all using freedom of information, but it's just one piece of what they do. It's just one tool in their toolkit. So in lieu of something huge like a leak or a big whistleblower steps forward, I mean, these are the options people have. You have to use these tools sometimes, and they seem like they are the tool of the state. Like freedom of information is something that the state invented and gave to people as a right. And it doesn't seem like it's going to lead to transformative politics or any kind of revolutionary change. But people become really knowledgeable on how to do this, and FOI just becomes one tool that they find some advantages in.
Very interesting. A few comments I have is, first, I did not know that Impact was Canadian-based. So that's, exciting, interesting. And then also what you said about sort of using FOIs and how people don't think that they're for them necessarily. And I think that there's also this sort of connotation with digital activism for, say, maybe not the activists that you're interviewing in social movement groups that are maybe better established, but sort of the individual online that's participating in things like Collectivism and the like. They seem so out of reach, and we have this association that anything online digital activism is quick and it's rapid and it'll all just work out super fast, and we expect that change to be instant. But that's not the reality. And hard things or good things can also take a lot of time. And sort of my example, now that we had talked about a bit more of where this question came from, would be more of a local example of Emily Lowen as the BC Green Party leader. And I'm not sure how they acquired the information, but more topical, the Jim Pattison, one of his buildings being sold to become an ICE center, and sort of how they've mobilized that and then was actually able to sort of mitigate or stop that sale because of collective backlash, I guess you could say. And that's something that was just a matter of somebody doing the work to find out that information and then visceralizing it, to use your own language. Very interesting stuff. Definitely seems to be building and building, at least from my perspective.
I just wanted to say one more thing about this is that I think the field is changing very quickly, right? And in both directions, right? We need to think about this as almost a kind of a dialogic process, a kind of conversation where activists are, as they engage with the state or state institutions, or as they engage with powerful people, right, to get this information, it's not just a transparent process that becomes increasingly clear over time. It's like powerful people, powerful institutions will respond and adapt. They'll change, right, in ways that in some ways will make things more clear, right, in terms of what methods we can take to kind of get access to things, but also make things more opaque, right? They'll change up their strategies and tactics, and they'll try to make it easier or more difficult next time. You know, if activists want to get access to, documents that are able to show the ownership of ICE facilities or whatever, right? Or if they want to get access to emails, right? These institutions will get more adept to deleting these emails or making it more opaque, the processes that you need to undertake to get access to them and full access, beyond redactions and things like that. So it's kind of like a double-sided process. And when we're talking about transparency, I think, we could talk about how maybe we're moving to a new kind of era of transparency, but I would also say it's a new era of opacity as well, because things are being hidden or made opaque in ways that they weren't before, and that's in response to these struggles. And we can see how this is an uneven process that is taking shape in different ways depending on the strategies that people are using and the institutions that they're confronting.
Thank you. Yeah, it sort of sounds like a horrible dance, for a lack of better words, but I can definitely see, now that you say that, definitely a good point of things are changing and it's very fast, and sort of any action spurs more action from like the opposing side if we're thinking of the institutional power versus the general public. Sort of one of my more final questions before some little quick ones, but despite my optimism and the evidence of digital activism working in terms of mobilizing movements and making change, and I've mentioned this, do you think the reality of collectivism and often this general desensitization to a lot of causes that is a symptom of many online networks is stagnating social movements relative to pre-digital eras?
Well, one thing that I could jump in with first is that a lot of folks that we talk to in the book, they feel this, they recognize this, and it's somewhat connected to visualization. Is like folks will go from the digital to the analog or something more tactile, something like we talk to groups that are doing yarning and weaving, and they're like making these tapestries of life and meaning instead of going to the digital, because they feel that alienation. They feel like it's a little bit anti-human almost to just be clicking all day. So yeah, we talk to groups all over the world that are going back to these ways of just feeling and creating together that are not digital. And I think that's really important because, one, it allows the group to kind of rebuild and gain some momentum, gain some capacity, and just create solidarity, create some bonds. That's always been a big part of social movements, is emotions and that bond that you form. Two, it's a really creative output that then is another way of hooking other people into the movement. And three, I think it is a kind of resistance to the tendency of the digital to lead towards capture. Like, the digital is capturing our keystrokes, our conversations, our thoughts, our desires. Like, we are just kind of like pinned down by the digital in a lot of ways. So a lot of the groups, they were getting away from the digital, and it was really powerful to see some of the ways that they did it.
Yeah, I would just jump in here and say also that connects to this question you had about the community of practice and care, right? Where, as with social movement activities more generally, like, it's always a problem. The the problem of burnout, right? And how, difficult it can be for people to keep going sometimes, especially, if you're uh, if you're under surveillance, you're facing a lot of scrutiny from powerful actors, from the state. Also, in terms of the content that you're engaging with, some of the people we talk to are engaging with very, very difficult, uh, hard to handle emotional content uh, every day, right? And it's some of the people that we talk to. They're focused on issues of genocide, right? And people making claims or arguments that that are genocidal, right? And so it's hard to be uh, processing that content just at an emotional level every day. And so um, what what we were interested in looking at is less of that this is like an epochal kind of problem or a problem of our era, and we're more interested in the strategies that people develop to keep going, right? Recognizing burnout is an ongoing problem. Well, what are groups doing to try to kind of fight that? And how are groups giving people the energy and support they need to feel like they want to keep going? And beyond that, developing their capacities, right? Going beyond what they're just doing now to learning and developing other ways of doing things, right? And building the movement, building social justice struggles in the process, where they're growing rather than shrinking in terms of the worlds that they're engaging with, right? So uh, we see that as a strategic issue, right? And social movement groups, activists have developed a lot of different ways, like Kevin mentioned, in terms of creating a sense of capacity, decentering the digital, and kind of recognizing the emotional uh, labor that goes into engaging with a lot of this stuff.
Obviously, it's the goal of your book, but thank you for sort of reiterating this idea of it's not necessarily the solutions, but what are the barriers and what are people doing about it? And I see that from a very like a positive place of that's the foundation, and there's so much to learn. And in the interest of time, I did want to finish with a question of very simply, who should read your book, or who did you write your book for?
I think that we wanted to write a book that people could pick up, and if they're organizing locally against police violence and brutality, they're organizing locally against prisons and jails and detention centers, there's some kind of issue in their community that is causing injustice. It could be the state, it could be corporations, that they could pick this up and they could learn, not really from us, but from all these groups from around the world that were really generous in sharing their time, sharing their insights for the book. That's who I think we're writing it for, is like groups that are out there that can learn from these other groups in the future that will have to struggle with new kinds of surveillance, new kinds of digital enclosures and intrusions on their lives, that will have to learn from previous measures that people have taken, previous ways that people have survived this oppression. And I think that's who we mostly had in mind.
Yeah, I would just say that, what we're doing is we want to provide people with this sort of toolbox, right? And so if you're interested in getting involved in the social justice struggle, or if you are involved in the social justice struggle, right, and you want to some ideas for tools that you could use, especially kind of related to data gathering, data mobilization, you want to get a sense of things that you could use, right? I think you might benefit from reading this book. It could be helpful for you. We really, our overall goal is like, we want this to be useful for people. And so that's our kind of number one audience. But even if you're not directly involved in social justice struggles, I think if you take a look through the book, you'll get a good sense of, how other people engaging in these struggles are doing this work, and how these struggles are unfolding in these different areas related to surveillance, related to archives, open data, related to visualizing and mobilizing data, right? So you'll get a good sense of the field, I think, when you look at the book. And as Kevin mentioned, really the breadth of the book is significant here, right? The fact that we're not just looking at one space where these struggles are taking place, but we talk to groups operating in a number of different spaces. And so part of what we want to do is help create a space of communication between these different groups, right? In terms of thinking about how these strategies might be taken up and used, applied in different places, and adapted, right? So learning, again, I think is an important part of it, how we can facilitate learning and capacity building.
Amazing. Well, I'm excited to read Mobilizing Data Justice. And sort of to finish it off, I like to give my guests the final words. It can be about what we talked about or just anything, sort of your personal soapbox. So I'll hand it over to you two for the last words.
I would just say there are some books that people write because in academia you're kind of on a treadmill and you just have to publish. It doesn't really mean a whole lot. But this book, I think, when you see what people have gone through surviving and enduring oppression and state and corporate surveillance, and they come out of it on the other side, and they're just so generous to share what they've learned. And they just keep walking, they keep moving, and they just want people to hear their stories. Like, there's something inspiring about that. So for me, it goes beyond just, publishing a book for knowledge sake. And I would just flag the publisher, BTL, Between the Lines Books in Toronto, has been doing this since 1977. Like, they publish books that really mean something in the context of social movements and struggles for justice. So a book like this could really only appear with a press like that. Yeah,
I think, I share what Kevin says, right, in terms of having that supportive infrastructure, kind of recognizing here, that the kinds of knowledge and ideas that we're sharing, right, it's something that's produced by different communities, right, and recognizing that learning and capacity building is a collective process. And so kind of seeing our book as just kind of part of this wider network of a collective activity that's being done. And as a part of that, I would also say this not just the book that people should check out, but we also have a website, um, and we have podcasts where we have interviewed people doing this work. And I would recommend that people, if they're interested in this topic, you check it out. Um, and on the website, we also provide a bunch of resources that you can use and take up in doing this work. So the book is just one part of this project, but there's a lot of other stuff too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin and Chris. It was really great to learn about your book and your research more generally.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks. This was great.
Thank you, Chris and Kevin, for the conversation. I learned some things, I have new questions, and I can't wait to give this book a read. Make sure to check out the Mobilizing Data for Justice website and podcast, which will be linked in the description. You can find more from me at KennyC402 on Substack, and you can find more episodes of this podcast, Social Sleuth, like last month's with Dr. Edwin Hodd that I mentioned earlier, wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening. Keep sleuthing.